Have you ever looked at someone you grew up with, someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally, and realized you were staring at a complete stranger wearing a familiar face? Because that's exactly what happened to me. And by the time I figured it out, my entire financial future was sitting on the edge of a cliff. Don't forget to subscribe to Frost Revenge and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. You're going to want to see how every single piece of this falls apart for the people who thought they had me cornered. My name is Claire Morrison, and I'm 38 years old. I own a small bakery called Morning Light in Austin, Texas, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and mismatched chairs that regulars treat like their own living room. I've built it from nothing over 11 years, 6 days a week, hands in dough before sunrise, doing my own bookkeeping at night. It's not glamorous, but it's mine, and that distinction matters more than most people understand until someone tries to take it from you. The building Morning Light operates out of belonged to my father. He bought it in 1994 for a fraction of what it's worth today, renovated it himself over 2 years of weekends, and ran his own hardware store there until he retired. When he passed 3 years ago, he left the building to me specifically, not to my older brother Marcus, not to be split between us. To me, in writing, notarized, witnessed, and filed with the county. The property is currently valued at just over $650,000, and there's a waiting list of developers who would buy it tomorrow if I ever decided to sell. My father made that decision deliberately, and I knew why, even if Marcus refused to accept it. For nearly a decade before Dad died, Marcus had borrowed money from our parents with the kind of reliability that made their savings disappear. He borrowed $15,000 for a car that lasted 18 months. He borrowed $30,000 to start a landscaping business that collapsed in its second season. He borrowed smaller amounts so frequently that my mother started keeping a separate notebook just to track what he owed. Marcus always had an explanation, always had a plan, always swore the next thing would be different. My father was not a bitter man, but he was a practical one. He loved Marcus the way you love someone despite their choices, and he protected what he'd worked for accordingly. Marcus married Dana when he was 36. She's the kind of woman who speaks in careful, measured sentences that always sound reasonable until you examine what she's actually saying underneath them. She wore expensive clothes on a budget that didn't support them, and she treated every family gathering like an audition for a lifestyle she hadn't earned yet. I tried, genuinely tried, to like her. For the first 2 years of their marriage, I invited her to things, asked about her interests, made space for her in family events. She was pleasant enough in return, which I mistook for warmth for longer than I should have. The shift started subtly, the way these things always do. About 8 months after my father's estate was settled and the building was officially in my name, Marcus called me on a weekday afternoon with what he described as a family conversation he'd been putting off. He said he'd been talking to a friend who was an attorney, not his attorney, just a friend. And this friend had mentioned that when parents leave assets to one child and not another, it sometimes created complications down the line. Legally speaking, he wanted me to understand that he wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted to know if Dad and I had ever talked about the building, about what Dad really wanted for the family long term. I told him yes, we had talked about it. Dad wanted me to keep running the bakery and building equity in the property. That was the conversation, and Dad put it in writing. Marcus went quiet for a moment, then said he understood, that he just wanted clarity, and that he hoped we could always talk openly about these things. The call lasted 12 minutes. When I hung up, something sat uncomfortably in my chest that I couldn't name yet. The requests started 2 months later. Not requests for the building, not directly, but requests for money. Marcus's truck needed transmission work. Dana had a health issue that insurance wasn't covering fully. The furnace in their house gave out in January. Each time, Marcus framed it as temporary, as something he'd pay back when the timing was better. I helped him twice. The third time he asked, I told him I didn't have the liquidity right now, which was partially true and mostly self-preservation. He accepted it politely, and Dana sent me a text 2 days later saying she completely understood and that they were figuring things out. The message had 3 heart emojis. I stared at my phone for a long time after reading it. What I didn't know then was that my refusals were accelerating something that had already been set in motion. Over the following months, Dana started showing up at the bakery. Not often enough to seem suspicious, maybe once every few weeks, always under the guise of being in the neighborhood or picking up something for a dinner party. She asked questions that seemed like friendly curiosity. How were the lease terms structured on the building? Did I have partners, or was the whole operation solely mine? Had I thought about what would happen to the property if something happened to me? Since I didn't have a husband or kids, she always wrapped these questions in warmth, always followed them with a compliment about the croissants or the lemon tarts, always left me feeling vaguely unsettled without being able to articulate why. My friend Joanna, who has known me since college and has a talent for seeing through people that I've always envied, sat across from me at my kitchen table one night and said, very plainly, that Dana was casing the place. I told her she was being dramatic. Joanna looked at me the way she does when she's waiting for me to catch up. 2 weeks later, I came into the bakery early and found my property manager, a man named Gerald who handles the commercial lease administration for the building, looking uncomfortable near the back entrance. He told me someone had called him the previous week asking detailed questions about my ownership structure and whether the building was free of liens or disputes. The caller had identified herself as my sister-in-law, calling on my behalf. I had not asked Dana to call Gerald. I had not asked Dana to do anything on my behalf. I had not even spoken to her in 3 weeks. I drove home that night with my hands perfectly steady on the wheel, and my mind doing something I can only describe as going precisely cold. I called Joanna before I even took my coat off. The following Monday, I hired a private investigator named Sandra Reeves, a former paralegal who had spent 12 years in family law before going independent. I told her everything: the calls to my father's estate attorney while the will was being processed, the visits to the bakery, the call to Gerald, the money requests. Sandra listened without interrupting, then told me she'd be in touch within 2 weeks. She was back in 10 days. What Sandra had found went further than I'd imagined. Marcus had consulted with 2 separate attorneys in the past year about contesting my father's will on the grounds of undue influence, meaning he was building an argument that Dad had been cognitively diminished at the time he made his final estate decisions, and that I had manipulated him into cutting Marcus out. This was false in every verifiable way. My father had been sharp and deliberate until his final months, and his estate attorney had documented their conversations carefully. But a contested will, even a groundless one, could freeze assets and cost an unrepresented party significant money and legal fees to defend. Marcus knew this. Sandra had also found something worse. Dana had been in contact with a commercial real estate developer named Hartwell Properties, a mid-size firm that specialized in buying and converting older buildings in transitional Austin neighborhoods. Their email exchange, which Sandra obtained through sources I won't detail here, discussed the Morning Light property specifically. Dana had told a Hartwell representative that the building was likely to become available in the next 12 to 18 months and that she wanted to establish a relationship in advance. She described the situation as a family ownership dispute that was moving toward resolution. There was no dispute. There was no resolution in progress. Dana was pre-selling access to my building before she and Marcus had done a single thing to actually take it from me. Sandra saved the piece that turned my blood to something colder than ice for last. During a recorded conversation between Marcus and Dana in their car, which Sandra had obtained legally through methods she assured me were airtight, Dana could be heard saying that the easiest path would be to get Claire to doubt herself. Dana said I had a history of anxiety, which was technically true in that I'd gone through a difficult period after my divorce 5 years ago and had seen a therapist for about a year. Dana was suggesting they could use that to build a picture of someone who was emotionally fragile and financially impulsive, someone who maybe shouldn't be trusted with a major commercial asset. Then Marcus laughed and said, "She already trusts us. That's the problem with Claire. She always thinks the best of people." I sat in Sandra's office for a long time after she finished. I looked at the printed emails and the typed transcript of that recording. I thought about every holiday dinner where Dana had hugged me and called me her favorite sister-in-law. I thought about every call from Marcus that had started with, "Hey, I hate to ask, but..." I thought about my father working weekends in that building with paint on his forearms and sawdust in his hair. And then I stopped feeling anything except focused. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I spent the better part of my adult life giving people the benefit of the doubt, including Marcus, including Dana. longer than either of them deserved. What I decided to do next was not about punishment. It was about making absolutely certain that what my father built, and what I had spent 11 years growing, would remain exactly where it belonged. My attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who has handled my business affairs since I opened Morning Light, was not surprised when I called her. She had seen the early signs herself, and had gently suggested a year prior that I consider formalizing my ownership protections. We spent the next 3 weeks moving quietly and completely. The Morning Light building was transferred into a single-member LLC with Patricia, named as the registered agent. A new estate plan was drafted that removed any ambiguity about succession. Every document that Marcus might try to use against me was reviewed, secured, or updated. Patricia also flagged something significant. The will contest Marcus had been researching was legally weak, but not impossible to file. If he filed it before we had our LLC structure fully established, it could create a temporary cloud on the title that would affect my ability to refinance or lease. We needed to move fast, and we needed to move quietly. For 3 weeks, I said nothing to Marcus or Dana. I kept showing up to the bakery, kept answering Dana's occasional texts warmly, kept playing the role of someone who had no idea what was coming. The performance was exhausting in a way I hadn't expected. Every time Dana sent me a friendly message asking how business was going, I had to remind myself that she was calculating when to pull the floor out from under me. Every time Marcus called to check in with that older brother ease that I had once genuinely found comforting, I had to keep my voice exactly level. Sandra was still monitoring their activity, and what she reported over those 3 weeks made it clear that Marcus and Dana believed they were the ones controlling the timeline. Marcus had formally engaged one of the 2 attorneys he'd been consulting and had signed a retainer. Dana had a second meeting scheduled with the Hartwell Properties representative for the following month, this time to discuss pricing structures. They were accelerating because they thought I was sitting still. I was not sitting still. The trap, for lack of a better word, came together through a combination of Patricia's legal strategy and Sandra's operational experience. The idea was straightforward. Marcus needed to make an overt, documented move before we could involve law enforcement in any meaningful way. Sandra had enough for a civil case, but for criminal exposure, we needed Marcus to actually do something, to commit an act of fraud that was clean and unambiguous on the record. Patricia suggested a mediation meeting. We would reach out to Marcus, through his newly retained attorney, and offer to discuss the building dispute in a formal setting. The goal was to get him on record making specific false claims about my father's intent and about the validity of the will. What Marcus didn't know was that the mediator we proposed was a retired judge named Harold Finch, who was also a former fraud investigator, and that Sandra would be present in the building with 2 detectives from the Austin Financial Crimes Unit. I made one additional decision. I needed Marcus and Dana to believe, going into that meeting, that I was nervous and unprepared. I needed them to walk into that conference room feeling like they were about to win, so I called Marcus. I told him I'd heard from my attorney that he'd been looking into the estate, and that, honestly, it had really upset me. I let my voice crack slightly. I told him I didn't want to fight with him, that family mattered more than any building, and that maybe we should just talk. He was careful, measured, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath his words when he said he was glad I'd called and that of course we could work something out. He said Dana had always said this didn't need to be adversarial. I thanked him. I said I just wanted it to be over. When I hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen for about 10 minutes. Then I washed my face, made coffee, and went over the documents Patricia had prepared one more time. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at a neutral attorney's office downtown. Marcus arrived in his best jacket, the kind of deliberate effort that tells you someone believes they're walking into a victory. Dana wore something professional and conservative, her expression arranged into something that probably looked like reasonableness to anyone who didn't know her. Their attorney, a man named Croft, carried a briefcase and the particular confidence of someone who has been told his case is solid. I arrived with Patricia and said nothing beyond polite greetings. The proceedings began normally enough. Croft laid out Marcus's position, that my father had shown signs of cognitive decline in the final year of his life, that he had been under what Croft carefully called emotional pressure from his primary caregiver, meaning me, and that the will as written did not reflect his true intentions. He had prepared a document that included statements from two people Marcus claimed were witnesses to my father's confusion. People who said they'd heard him express regret about his estate decisions. I watched Marcus while Croft spoke. He sat with his hands folded, nodding occasionally, doing an excellent impression of a man who had been wronged and was patiently seeking justice. When Croft finished, Patricia calmly placed a folder on the table and asked Marcus directly whether the two individuals named in his witness statements had ever actually met with his attorney prior to signing those documents. Marcus looked at Croft. Croft looked at the folder. Patricia opened it. The folder contained Sandra's full investigation report, including the email exchange between Dana and Hartwell Properties, the recorded conversation from the car, the documentation of every contact Dana had made with Gerald and with my father's estate attorney, and a sworn statement from one of the two alleged witnesses who had been approached by Marcus and told that signing the statement was a formality that wouldn't actually affect anything in court. That witness had called our office 2 days prior and told us everything. The door to the conference room opened, and Sandra walked in with the two detectives. I watched Dana understand what was happening before Marcus did. Her face went through something I can only describe as a sequence of calculations, each one arriving at the same answer. Marcus turned toward the door, then back to me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. He looked like someone who had stepped onto what he thought was solid ground and felt it dissolve under him. One of the detectives addressed them both by name and explained that they were being detained pending questioning related to allegations of wire fraud, fraudulent misrepresentation, and conspiracy to defraud property. Attorney Croft immediately said he needed to speak with his client privately. The detective told him he was welcome to do that at the station. I stayed in my chair while they were escorted out. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel sad. I felt the particular quietness that comes when something you've been bracing for finally happens and you discover your own steadiness surprised you. Patricia put her hand on my arm briefly and said, "You did well." I nodded, picked up my coffee cup, and realized it had gone completely cold while I was sitting there. The legal process that followed took 8 months. Marcus and Dana hired a second attorney after Croft withdrew from the case. The evidence against them was not subtle. The Hartwell Properties emails alone were enough to establish intent, and the recorded conversation documented both their awareness that they were operating fraudulently and their specific plan to use my mental health history as a tool to undermine my credibility. The witness statement they had solicited under false pretenses added a separate charge of suborning a false affidavit. Their attorney pushed for a plea arrangement, which the prosecution eventually accepted, partly because I indicated through Patricia that I had no interest in a drawn-out trial and preferred resolution. Marcus pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of civil conspiracy. Dana pleaded guilty to wire fraud and fraud on the court. Marcus was sentenced to 14 months in federal prison, with 2 years of supervised release. Dana received 22 months, because the evidence showed she had been the primary architect of the Hartwell scheme and had taken more overt actions to solicit fraudulent documentation. They were also ordered jointly to pay my legal fees, which came to just over $47,000. The collateral damage to their own lives was something I had not planned but had not prevented. Marcus lost his position at the property management company where he'd worked for 6 years. The criminal conviction disqualified him from holding certain licenses in Texas. Dana's professional network in real estate circles, which she'd spent years cultivating, evaporated within weeks of the charges becoming public. The house they'd been renting went back to the landlord when they could no longer make payments. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that their belongings went into storage. I thought about that, the two of them arranging their things in boxes, the same way they had planned to arrange mine. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. It was more like a specific kind of sorrow. The kind you feel for someone who had a choice and chose badly and can't undo it. There is one part of this story I want to tell carefully, because it matters more to me than the fraud charges or the sentence or the $47,000. Marcus and I have a younger cousin named Ellie who is 22 and was very close to both of us growing up. When the story became family knowledge, Ellie called me crying. She wasn't angry at me. She was just devastated in the way young people are when the adults they trusted turn out to be something they didn't expect. She asked me how I could have let it go this far, why I hadn't just talked to Marcus directly, whether there was something I could have done to stop it before it became criminal. I thought about those questions for a long time before I answered. I told her that I had talked to Marcus, my entire adult life, and that every conversation about money and fairness and what our father had intended had ended with Marcus finding a new reason why he deserved something he hadn't earned. I told her that the line between trying to resolve something and being manipulated into surrendering to it is blurrier than anyone thinks when they're standing in the middle of it. I told her I was sorry that she was hurting, and that I loved her, and that none of what Marcus and Dana did was her responsibility to carry. She and I have dinner once a month now. She's studying accounting, and she asks good questions about how I structured the LLC and why. I answer them honestly. I figure if this whole thing has to have produced something useful, it can at least produce one more person in the world who knows how to protect what they've built. Marcus has sent me 2 letters since his sentencing. I read them both, because I thought I owed myself the honesty of knowing what he had to say. The first one was an apology that felt mostly like an explanation, a long account of the financial pressure they'd been under, the way Dana had pushed the idea forward, the way it had started small and then couldn't be stopped. The second one was shorter and quieter, and in it he said he knew he had turned our father's life's work into something shameful, and that he was sorry not for getting caught but for being the kind of person who needed to be caught. I haven't written back. I don't know yet if I ever will. What I know is that forgiveness, if it comes, will be something I choose for myself, and not something I give because I feel obligated or because time passed and it seemed like the appropriate thing to do. My father believed in earning what you receive. I think that applies to forgiveness too. Morning Light opened this past spring with a renovated kitchen and 2 new employees. We added a small event space in the back of the building, the part my father used for storage, and on the weekends we do baking classes for small groups. There is something that feels right about people learning something in that room, about the building being useful in a way my father would have recognized. The building is worth more now than it was 3 years ago. The LLC is structured properly. Patricia reviews my documents every 6 months. Sandra sends me a birthday text every year, and I always respond because some people earn that. My brother and his wife thought they were taking something from a person who trusted too easily and wouldn't see it coming. They were wrong on both counts, and the difference between what they planned and what actually happened is the entire distance between a person who knows her own worth and one who doesn't. I know mine, and I am still exactly where I belong. If this story reminded you of something you've been through, or someone you need to protect yourself from, leave a comment below. And if you haven't subscribed to Frost Revenge yet, now is a good time. There are more stories where this one came from, and none of them end the way the wrong people hoped they would.